very good morning to all of you. Now, what I will do over the next maybe 35 or 40 minutes is talk to you on a concept which is called as good clinical practice. Okay. Now, this good clinical practice was laid down for the first time in 1996 by ICH, or the International Conference on Harmonization, and subsequently in 2000 and 2001 we had our own GCP guidelines, that is the India GCP guidelines. Now, beginning with the historical perspective, that is the foundation of GCP, the development of good clinical practices historically has been reactive to events or tragedies. The first thing which triggered the concept of GCP or good clinical practice were the Nuremberg trials. Now, all of you would be aware of the atrocities which were committed against the Jews by the Nazis. Okay? And in 1947, you had a horrendous set of experiments which were conducted by the Germans. This included experimental starvation, experimentally induced gangrene, subjecting patients to low barometric pressure, inducing and inflicting burns and wounds, all of which were to see to what extent the human body could be stretched. Okay, these were the kind of experiments that were carried out in Nuremberg. And what are the characteristics of these experiments? All of these experiments were conducted without the consent of the individuals. Nobody wanted to go through these experiments. All of them produced unnecessary pain and suffering. There was absolutely no benefit for the people who were participating in these experiments. And finally, none of these experiments had any scientific basis. None of them had any rationale for being done. So the event was the Nuremberg trial, okay, and the knee-jerk reaction was the foundation of GCP and the Nuremberg Code, which was laid down in 1948. And why was the Nuremberg Code established in 1948? One of the primary reasons was to prevent similar atrocities from happening to other participants in clinical research. And what the Nuremberg Code really said was that all participation should be entirely voluntary, which means that you have to take consent from patients who are participating in these studies. All the experiments must be supported by strong scientific rationale. All of them should have a scientific basis. All of them should be scientifically valid. That means they need to be done. Physical and mental suffering, damage to patients or volunteers in experiments is not permissible and cannot be done. And finally, the most important thing, from any clinical research or any clinical trial, every subject has the right to withdraw. I mean, he can say, I don't wish to participate in the study anymore, and he has the right to opt out of the study at any point in time without having to give reasons for opting out of the study. So you had the Nuremberg trial and you had the Nuremberg Code in 1948, and everybody said, fine, first class, things are going on beautifully, right? What happened? You had another problem. In the 1950s and 1960s, and those of you who are pharmacologists in the audience would know this, thalidomide was being used. Thalidomide was marketed for morning sickness, it was being used for epilepsy, it was used as a sedative hypnotic. And there was a very astute physician, his name was James McBride, he was from Austria, and what he realized was that a lot of women that were coming to him were bringing in children that were being born with defective limbs. They were being born with a condition called as phocomelia, which is seal-like limbs. He published his findings, and the only thing that he was able to link phocomelia to was the fact that all of these women seemed to have taken thalidomide somewhere during the first trimester of pregnancy. And this thalidomide, unfortunately, produces tragedies even today. A few months back, I went for a conference on pharmacovigilance, and there was a speaker who had come from Brazil, and he showed a photograph of a child with phocomelia born in Brazil in 2006 after the mother had consumed thalidomide. So although this tragedy took place in the 1960s or 61, we still have children being born with phocomelia. Now, one of the things that governments worldwide realized was that drugs were not being adequately tested for safety and efficacy before they were marketed. And thalidomide was in fact tested only in 300 subjects before it was put on the market. So you had an event, and again you had a reaction to it. So what was the reaction to it? In 1962, the US government passed this Kefauver-Harris Amendment, which said that drugs needed to be adequately tested for safety and efficacy before they were marketed. All the safety and efficacy data on the drugs need to be reviewed, and only when evidence of safety and efficacy was available, drugs would be permitted for marketing. So you had the first event, which was the Nuremberg event, 47, 48 Nuremberg Code, 61 thalidomide, 62 Kefauver-Harris Amendment. So everybody said now everything is fine. So let's continue with life because we have safeguards in place. In 1964, the Declaration of Helsinki was adopted by the World Medical Association, and the Declaration of Helsinki has 4 principles. Okay? The first 3 principles actually. The first principle is justice, which means that there should be equitable distribution of burdens and benefit. It's not that somebody should bear the burden and somebody else should bear the benefits of research. So there should be distributive justice. That was the first principle. The second was beneficence. That means maximize benefit, which also included non-maleficence, that is, do no harm to your subjects. And finally, autonomy, that is, respect for the individual. Each individual is an autonomous agent. Each individual is capable of taking decisions on his own. There should be a sense of voluntariness. And for those of whom autonomy is not possible, for some reason, you need to protect those whose autonomy is challenged in some way. So 62 you had the Kefauver-Harris Amendment, and 64 you had the Declaration of Helsinki. And while all of this was taking place, in America's backyard, there was another study which was going on, and that was the Tuskegee syphilis study. The Tuskegee syphilis study was actually a study which was conducted by the US Public Service Commission between 1932 and 1972. And what researchers really wanted to do during the Tuskegee study was to study the natural history of syphilis. So how best to study the natural history of syphilis? Don't give patients any treatment at all. Which patients will you not treat at all? Black African Americans from Alabama. So you had a randomized control trial, and penicillin had been already discovered at that point in time by Alexander Fleming. So you had a randomized control trial, in one arm of which you had black Americans who were syphilitic and did not receive penicillin. And this trial continued until 1972. So you had an event again, and then you had a reaction to the event. In 1972, you had a panel which was set up, which was called as the Tuskegee panel, and you had 2 people who actually said that stringent regulations must be laid down so that minorities are not subjected to this kind of discrimination in clinical trials and clinical research. So you had Brodus Butler and J. Katz who called for a major role in regulation, and actually in 1997, the then President of the United States, Bill Clinton, had to publicly issue an apology for the Tuskegee studies. So what happened was, in 1977, after the document was published calling for regulations, you had the CFR, the Code of Federal Regulations of the US FDA, which for the first time introduced the concept of GCP, and that is good clinical practice. So this was in the United States in 1977, by which time a lot of countries worldwide realized the problem of unethical research, and countries worldwide began looking at their own safety regulations, their own efficacy regulations, and people started implementing good clinical practice in their research studies. So in the European Union, you had the good clinical practice guidelines in 1991. In Japan, you had the GCP manual again in 1991, and the WHO had draft guidelines for good clinical practice in 1994. Now, what was the problem with all of this? No problem. Everybody was doing it. Problem was everybody was doing it at an individual level. So the United States had its own definitions, European Union had its own definitions, Japan had its own definition, and the WHO had its own definition. So what do? The concept is the same. You need to have good clinical practice. So what happened was the idea of coming together, harmonizing the effort so that the rights and well-being of subjects are protected was first mooted in 1989, and the first steering committee for putting together a guideline on good clinical practice was established in 1990. So if you see, the ICH actually stands for the International Conference on Harmonization, which brought together the pharmaceutical industry and regulators from the US FDA, European Union and Japan. So it was a mixture of regulators and the pharmaceutical industry, plus you had observers coming in from the Nordic countries, the WHO and Australia to form a set of guidelines. So regulators and industry were equal partners in the scientific and technical discussion of testing procedures relating to the safety, the efficacy and the quality of medicines which were being used for clinical research and clinical trials. So like I said, you had three people basically, the European Union, Japan and the US FDA, plus observers from Australia, WHO and the Nordic countries. Initially, the ICH focused on three main topics. Primary, of course, was S, which stands for safety. The second was E, which stands for efficacy. The third is Q, which stands for quality. And more recently, a fourth set of guidelines has been added, which is the M guideline, and that is the multidisciplinary guidelines. So you have regulators, pharmaceutical industry, observers coming together to create four sets of guidelines: safety, efficacy, quality and multidisciplinary. Whatever I am telling you today is all available on the net. If you go to www.ich.org, you can actually download each and every one of these guidelines. So to give you some representative examples of what these guidelines look like, the safety guidelines are further divided into S1, S2, S3, so on up to S8. For example, S1 is the guideline for carcinogenicity. S2 is the guideline for genotoxicity. S7 is the pharmacology guideline. If you go to the E guideline, the efficacy topics, you have E1 and E2, which are clinical safety guidelines, E3, which is the guideline for writing reports. But what we will concern ourselves today with is the E6 guideline, which is the good clinical practice guideline. So tomorrow if you have a quiz or you have an exam at the end of your 4 weeks or 5 weeks and asks you what is the ICH guideline, you say the ICH guideline is the E6 guideline. Although the focus is on safety and efficacy both, it comes under an efficacy guideline. And there are very, very new guidelines and very, very interesting guidelines. The E14 guideline is actually a guideline on safety, that is QTC interval. What happens when the QTC interval is prolonged both with cardiac drugs and non-cardiac drugs. Another very interesting guideline is what happens when there is inter-individual variability in response. What happens when there is inter-country differences in response to medication. So you have the E15 guideline on pharmacogenetics, and as this committee keeps meeting year after year, more and more guidelines keep getting added. And the moment you see E something R, R simply means there is a revision. So if you have E1 R1, that means the E1 is the original guideline and the R is actually a first revision of the guideline depending upon data and how it is actually evolved. Similarly, you have the Q guidelines, which are quality guidelines. Q1 is stability, Q2 analytical validation, Q9 is quality risk management, and you have the multidisciplinary guidelines. For example, M1 is your MedDRA guidelines for adverse drug reaction. So if one were to define good clinical practice, and again it's the ICH E6 guideline, the E6 guideline basically serves two purposes. Good clinical practice ensures that the rights, the safety and the well-being of subjects in clinical research is protected, A, and B, whatever data that you generate from your clinical trial or clinical research, it's credible. So the two pillars of the ICH good clinical practice guidelines are safety of subjects and two, credibility of the data that you generate. And if you were to formally define it, it is an international scientific ethical quality standard. So you have safety, quality, efficacy, all of which are addressed in the definition. So an international scientific ethical quality standard which deals with design of studies, recording of studies, collection of studies, reporting of studies, so that finally patient safety is protected and the data that you generate is quality data and data is credible and data that is acceptable worldwide. The moment you say that you've done a GCP study, it means that you have ensured that your participants are safe and you also ensured that the data that you've generated is absolutely credible. Why should we be talking about GCP today? One is it's the right thing to do. It's right to protect your patients and it's the right thing to generate good quality data. But more importantly, today GCP guidelines carry the authority of law. You are supposed to do clinical trials and clinical research even in this country as per GCP. And now the GCP guidelines, particularly the India GCP guidelines, are mandatory as per Schedule Y. Schedule Y of the Drugs and Cosmetics Act of 2005 clearly states that all studies should be done as per the guidelines which have been laid by CDSCO, that is the Central Standard Drugs Control Organization. And what does it do? Because you're using money, public money to do research, you're actually providing public assurance that the rights, the well-being, confidentiality of clinical participants are observed and consistently protected. So GCP today worldwide, including in your country, is actually statutory, it is mandatory. If you look at the ICH GCP guidelines, it's broadly divided into 8 parts. I won't go into detail into all of those parts, but I'll just give you an overview of what each is actually. The first part deals with the introduction to GCP, how GCP was formed, what was the historical perspective, who were the partners that came together, and when was it formed. The ICH guidelines were formally released in 1996. The first section deals with definitions or glossary. So you have everything from A to Z. A, for example, deals with adverse drug reactions. What is an adverse event? W will deal with something like well-being, right? Then you have a lot of other definitions which are used in clinical trials. What is CRO? CRO stands for a contract research organization. So the first part actually defines all the terms. The second part is what I will discuss, and 13 principles which form the foundations of ICH GCP. Portion number 3 talks about the composition and structure of institutional review boards and independent ethics committees. Sections 4 and 5 talk about the roles and responsibilities of an investigator and a sponsor. Section 6 deals with clinical trial protocols and protocol amendments. 7 talks about the investigator's brochure. What are the necessary documents that you put into an investigator's brochure before you do a study? And point number 8 deals with essential documents for conduct of a clinical trial. So this is how the ICH GCP guideline is actually represented. It looks like this. What I'm going to deal with today is point number 2 and the foundations and the principles of ICH GCP, which are 13 in number. Because it's point number 2, all the points come as 2.1, 2.2, 2.3, 2.4 and so on. The first principle of ICH GCP, clinical trials should be conducted in accordance with ethical principles which have their origins in the Declaration of Helsinki, number 1. Number 2, conducted in accordance with good clinical practice guidelines. And number 3, conducted in accordance with your country's regulatory requirements. Clinical trials should be conducted in accordance with principles which have their origin in the Declaration of Helsinki, which are consistent with GCP, which means do it by GCP, and the applicable regulatory requirements. In this country, you would do it with your country's regulatory requirements. So that's the first ICH principle. Second deals with risk-benefit analysis. Before the trial is initiated, anticipate the risks and the inconveniences that you may put the subject to. and these should be weighed against the benefits both for the individual and for the society. And a trial should be initiated and continued only if the benefits, foreseeable benefits, outweigh the foreseeable risks. So the second talks about risk benefit, the first talks about ethics and regulations. 2.3 deals with the subjects. The rights, the safety and the well-being of the trial subjects are the most important considerations, which means that at any point during the course of the study, if you feel that the interest or the safety of the subject is being jeopardized, you will stop the study, or you will take whatever necessary action is to be taken at that point, because the individual is more important than science and society. And this is what point number 3 reiterates, that the safety, the rights, the well-being of trial subjects are the most important considerations and shall prevail over the interest of science and society. Point number 4. The available non-clinical and clinical information on an investigational product should be adequate to support your study. When you begin a study, you have clinical information. For example, if you're doing a phase 3 study, you would have information from phase 1 studies and phase 2 studies. What is the non-clinical information that you will have? You will have information from animal studies. You will have information on dissolution, disintegration, product profile. So both your non-clinical information and your clinical information should support the proposed study. Only then should you actually go ahead and initiate your study. So that's principle number 4. Principle number 5 is the clinical trial should be scientifically sound. Unlike your Tuskegee experiments and the Nuremberg trials, you should have a valid scientific basis which should be clearly defined in a protocol, which means you have a hypothesis, you have a protocol, and you have defined objectives of your protocol. The corollary to this is your protocol should be approved by an independent review board or an independent ethics committee. So the moment you have a protocol, the next thing is the trial should be conducted in compliance with the protocol, and this protocol should have received the institutional ethics committee or the institutional review board approval. Once a patient goes into a trial as per protocol, you are duty bound to protect his rights, safety and well-being. So the medical care and the medical decisions which are taken for subjects who participate in clinical trials should be the responsibility of a qualified physician, which means that you should have somebody who is competent, who is qualified, looking after the medical care of subjects who participate in a study. And they've also mentioned that when appropriate, a qualified dentist. So this is rule number 7. Point number 8 talks about the physician who is providing medical care. How should he be qualified? He should be qualified by education, he should be qualified by training, and he should be qualified by experience to perform the research project. So one is he takes good care because he is qualified. Second is he himself should be qualified by education, training and experience. So that's your principle number 8. Principle number 9 is freely given informed consent, and this also includes assent wherever applicable, particularly for children over the age of 7 years, from every trial subject prior to clinical participation. So only when the consent is in place would you actually go ahead and initiate the study. Point number 10, we said there were 2 foundations for GCP. One is rights and well-being of subjects, and the second is credible data. How will you get credible data? You will get credible data if you record it and report it accurately. So point number 10 deals with data. All the clinical trial information should be recorded, handled and stored in a way which allows its accurate reporting, interpretation and verification. It's only when you do this correctly that you will have data which is credible and which will be accepted worldwide. Principle number 11, confidentiality. Somebody gives consent to participate, you ensure that information is kept confidential. So confidentiality of records that could identify subjects should be protected. Respect the privacy and confidentiality rules in accordance with whatever is the regulatory requirement that is applicable. So you also need to check the regulatory requirements in your own country before you proceed with the study. For example, we often allow monitors to look at clinical trial data. So confidentiality also will be in accordance with the protocol and the country's regulatory requirements. Point number 12 deals with the pharmaceutical product that you are testing. Investigational products should be manufactured, handled and stored according to GMP. That's good manufacturing practices, and they should be used in accordance with the approved protocol. The protocol says give the tablet thrice a day, give it thrice a day, don't give it twice a day, right? So your product itself should be made as per GMP, and you use it exactly the way the protocol describes that the product should be used. And the last principle deals with quality. Systems with procedures which assure that the quality of every aspect of your study is actually maintained. So it starts with ethics, it goes down to risk benefit, goes to informed consent, protocol, validity, approval, quality, product, and finally ends with quality of every aspect of what you do. When you take informed consent, you're following quality. When you document something, you're following quality. When you use a product correctly, you're following quality. So right from ethics down to quality, there are 13 principles of ICH GCP. Now we go to India GCP guidelines. About 5 years, 4.5 years after the ICH guidelines, we had the Drugs Controller General of India setting up an expert committee to make our own country's GCP guidelines. So these are called as the India GCP guidelines, and they are available on the CDSCO website. I'm sorry, I don't remember the URL. If you type in Google and put in CDSCO, you'll get the website. That is the Central Standard Drugs Control Organization, and you'll get your own country's GCP guidelines. Now, this India GCP guidelines contain some additional information which is not present in the ICH GCP guidelines. So what is this additional information? Section number 7 deals with special concerns, for example, vaccines, contraceptives, surgical procedures, medical devices, diagnostic agents, herbal remedies and medicinal plants. So there is an additional section there. You have an Appendix 2, which is Schedule Y of the Drugs and Cosmetics Act. So that's also added in your GCP guideline. And Appendix 3 gives you formats for submission of clinical trials, submission for approval for clinical trials, both for IND and investigational new drug, as well as a new drug application for recombinant products, DNA-based vaccines, diagnostics and other biologicals. Under India GCP, there's a lot of concern about people from outside the country sponsoring clinical trials in this country. So there is a section on roles and responsibilities of a foreign sponsor. So there's some additional information on that. And under the glossary, you have definitions which are given. So they include additional definitions for investigational labeling, study product, schedule, study management, patient files. Probably because these guidelines came 4 or 5 years after the ICH guidelines. So you have some similarities and you have some additional information. Over and above this, there are differences between the ICH GCP and the India GCP guidelines. I've just put in some of the differences to tell you that these are not identical, right? The formatting itself is different. The way the guideline looks is different because it's a different country and a different publisher. But basically the way the sections are structured are completely different, although the principles, the 13 principles that I mentioned, those remain constant. Now under definitions, there are again some differences. What is sub-investigator in ICH GCP becomes co-investigator here. What is source data becomes raw data. What is source documents becomes source data. ICH calls it institutional ethics committee. Our guideline calls it ethics committee. Doesn't make too much of a difference, but just to tell you that there are differences. One difference which is very, very prominent is the ethics committee. The ICH GCP guidelines actually discusses the ethics committee in fairly limited detail. It just tells you that you need to have at least 5 members, you need to have 1 member who is non-scientific, and you need to have 1 person who is non-affiliated. But if you look at the India GCP guidelines, these are fairly in detail with respect to ethics committees. It tells you that you need to have 5 to 7 members. You need at least 5 members for a quorum. The chairman of the committee should be from outside the institution. The member secretary should be preferably from within the institution, and if there is a point in the protocol where you want some clarifications, you are permitted to call the principal investigator for the meeting and ask for clarifications. These are things which are not given in the ICH guidelines but are given in the India GCP guidelines. There is also a difference in terms of record retention. How long do you keep your records? The ICH guideline says that you need to keep it for 2 years after the last approval in an ICH region. For example, if Japan is the last region where the product was approved, you need to keep your records for 2 years after that, or 2 years after you have discontinued clinical development. In the India GCP guideline, the record retention becomes the responsibility of the sponsor. And what the guideline says that it's the responsibility of the sponsor to keep it in safe custody. You need to maintain it for 5 years after the study is completed, or 5 years after data submission, whichever is later. So there is some difference in terms of record retention, but otherwise pretty much they are similar. So if I were to summarize good clinical practice has evolved out of tragedies. There have been reactions to tragedies. The first good clinical practice guideline probably came in 1977 from the United States, the Code of Federal Regulation, which mentioned the word GCP for the first time. Several countries took their own initiatives, but in 1989, the European Union, Japan and the US FDA, along with observers, came together to create harmonization, to bring together the pharma industry as well as regulators to put together guidelines. And you have 4 sets of guidelines which could be seen on ich.org relating to safety, S, E which is efficacy, Q which is quality, and multidisciplinary guidelines. But fundamentally, there are 13 principles on which these guidelines rest. And if I were to do a quick recap, ensure that your trial is conducted in accordance with ethical principles which have their origins in the Declaration of Helsinki. Do it as per GCP, do it as per your country's regulatory requirements. Ensure that all foreseeable risks and all foreseeable benefits are available to you a priori, and do the study only if you think that the benefits are going to outweigh the risks. At all points, ensure that the rights, the safety, the well-being of subjects is protected. The non-clinical and clinical information that's available to you must support the study to be conducted. You should have a valid scientific protocol which should be approved by the Institutional Ethics Committee or Review Board. Provide adequate medical care for your subjects, so you need to have a qualified physician or a qualified dentist. How should he be qualified? By training, knowledge and experience. Ensure that there is free, informed consent given from your subjects. The recording, the handling is done correctly, so your data are credible. Confidentiality of your subjects, but also keep in mind your local regulatory requirements. The product should be exactly as per GMP, Good Manufacturing Practice Guidelines, and to be used exactly as per the protocol, and ensure that you have quality maintained at every step of your study. And finally, what are the 2 pillars of GCP? Rights, safety, welfare of subjects being protected, A, and B, ensure that you have quality, credible and data which is generated from the research, so your integrity of your data is very, very important. I think that's all I had to say about ICH-GCP.
Madam, will you clarify the difference between source data and raw data, and the sub-investigator and co-investigator?
There's no difference. There's no difference.
Why the different names?
Because we are a different country. I don't know. It doesn't matter actually. I think what is important really is to understand the meaning of these 2 terms. The person who has the responsibility of the study, the onus of the study, is the principal investigator. Obviously, he can't work alone, so he needs to work with a team. Now, the team consists of a lot of people. So you have co-investigators who will assist him in doing the study. Whether it's co-investigator or sub-investigator, it doesn't matter. What I was trying to tell you based on the slide is simply that there are differences in terminology. It doesn't mean that what they mean is different. What is important for us is to understand the role that these people play in the conduct of the clinical trial. There's no difference between source data and raw data. Anything from which you transcribe onto your case record form, anything that you generate when you talk to your patient, investigations, ECGs, X-rays, investigations, all of this becomes source data or raw data. A rose by any other name would smell just as sweet.
Actually, I was thinking that Ra word has been used only to define the herbal source of research.
No. This deals with
source
documentation. No. This deals with documentation. The raw material that you're talking about for herbal products is something completely different. Here we are talking to data which is generated first time, from which you take your information and put it into your case record form. But it really doesn't make a difference because different people sat together and made it. That's all. There is really no difference. I just tried to make a point saying that there are some subtle differences between India GCP and the ICA GCP guidelines.
So all this you talk about good clinical practice was formed based on Nazi practice. I
Yes.
said all this you talk about good.
Yes.
Okay.
It was a fallout of the Nazi experiments. There have
Okay.
been other instances which I mentioned, the Focomelia that I talked about, the Tuskegee study. In fact, in 1966, in the New England Journal of Medicine, there was an anesthetist who published a series of articles. His name was Henry Beecher, right? And he published how unethical studies were being done even at that point, despite the fact that we had the Nuremberg Code and despite the fact that we had the Kefauver-Harris amendments. So a lot of things which have happened between 1930s and maybe the 1980s have gone into making GCP, one of which is the Nazi experiments. Perhaps those were the most horrific of all of them.
My question is related to traditional medicine once
Okay.
again. Are there any specific issues which is being told in these GCP guidelines related to traditional medicine?
I think the India GCP guidelines, the part on traditional medicines is fairly similar to the ICMR guidelines. I don't think there are any specific differences. In a sense, the India GCP guidelines is actually collated information from a lot of guidelines. I'm not going to use the word copy paste, but it's a lot of collated information.
Right.
So they're fairly similar to the ICMR
But
guidelines.
but again, I have raised this question because when it comes to safety, the drug safety, it's quite different from your this modern medicines and the Ayurvedic medicines.
Correct.
It starts right from the procuring of the drug, unlike the lab tested or lab generated drugs. So that's why the question came there, because there should be a proper guidelines for traditional medicine wherein it should start from procuring the drugs and then later on developing the drugs.
There are no differences. I mean, I think it is more or less what is there in the ICMR guidelines. Yeah.
Let me give one example of our experience. There was a device trial. The proposal was set to our committee.
Medical device.
Medical device,
Okay.
surgical device,
Okay.
means one part of a ventilator. Afterwards, there was a meeting. The principal investigator of our institution, he was there in the meeting. There were questions and all. Then we were taking some time to give permission because some issues were there which needed to be clarified. One fine morning we got a letter from the company who tried this device on this thing, that because there is no religious leader in the ethics committee, so they are withdrawing this proposal from our institute. Then religious leader, if to be there, how many?
Not too many.
How many?
One.
Yes.
Actually, I serve on an ethics committee where there is a bishop who's actually on the ethics committee. I think when you have a lot of different members, and the reason why these guidelines are formed is that you get different perspectives. No? You get perspective from a lay person, you get perspective from a scientific person. If people like us were only to
Only
serve
we
on
were
ethics
lacking in one Christian in our committee.
a priest.
Yes.
Okay.
Dr. Bhatna, my understanding of the situation is it's not necessary to have a religious person and person alone. What is insisted upon is the deep philosophical understanding, which is significant by its absence among the scientists, right? And therefore, it's not necessary you got to really go in for a priest, either of the Hindu or the Islamic or Christian religions. It's not necessary. Somebody who is, I mean, our Lobo would do just as good, right?
There was no.
Okay, that's one. The one more question, Dr. Nitya.
Yeah.
See, Schedule Y says
Yes.
that it's fair enough to give the names of the IEC folks to the sponsor, and the sponsors insist on it. What's your comment on that? I mean, personally, I would feel that it's not needed. You can give the composition and be done with it, but giving the names of the members of the IEC doesn't seem the right thing to do. Schedule Y has come out with it. Why so? If you have an
I
answer.
think the only reason that you don't want to give names to is that you're worried about undue pressures on people. I think that would be the only reason. Undue pressure, maybe coercion, influencing people, conflict of interest. These are the issues that come up when you give names. But the committees that we serve on, and even as per regulations, all the approvals will contain the names of people that have actually reviewed the project and finally signed it off. And see, the reason that you go on an ethics committee is you're fair, you're unbiased, you're going to give independent opinion. So it is assumed that you don't succumb to pressures, if any. Thank you.